And welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Dr. Abha Rajbhandari. How are you, Abha?
I'm doing good. Very nice to be in this podcast. Thank you for the invite.
Thanks. Well, my pleasure to have you, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you. Dr. Rajbhandari, you are a assistant professor in the departments of psychiatry and neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and you've obtained your Ph.D. in neuroscience from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as well, you are involved in NeuroChetanā, which I want to get into a little bit as well. So first off, I wanted to ask you, you specialize in dealing with the matters of the brain, and the brain is one of those organs that is quite undervalued. When we think of health, when we think of intelligence, things like that, it's really with intelligence that we get into the brain. But in terms of health, we think of the body mostly. And too often, I think we forget that the body is dictated by the brain, and it is a two-way street. And outside of health, if we get into sort of metaphysics, when we're dealing with reality, it's really the brain that is the antenna for receiving all of this information and converting it into reality for us, right? And that reality is perceptive. There's a very famous quote, I think it's by Thurl, who said um, that beauty is actually within us. I'm just paraphrasing the quote, but that if we look at an object, like if we look at a rose, really the colors that we see, the shapes and all of that, it is us that's processing it. So it's us that's giving meaning to it
Mhm.
and beauty to it, right?
Yeah.
Um, so if you can start off by just speaking, how important is the brain to all of us?
Yeah, really beautiful and thorough question. Yeah, the brain is a fascinating organ, right? The whole reason I got into neuroscience and studying the brain is so many aspects that you bring up about perception, how we process the world or the reality that we think of as reality. And the brain and its cells, which are called neurons, play a critical role in processing this information, giving meaning to it, and value to a lot of the things. And then it leads to these actions and reactions that we call behavior, that we call responses, which can be a spectrum of either normal behavioral responses or stressful responses, all of these things. So from these perspectives, the brain is critical because, like you said, it is the antenna, right? One of the things in neuroscience, it's still debatable, is does the brain create consciousness or brain an emergent property, or is it expressing consciousness, right? So in that sense, that's still a mystery in a lot of ways. There's theories about it, but overall, brain is critical, like you said, because it's a two-way street in the sense most of research in neuroscience focused on actually the top down, right? That brain controls everything, but not the bottom up, right? Like that the fact that brain is actually listening to our bodily organs, it's listening to our heart rate, it's listening to our breathing, gut functions, temperature, pain, all of these signals. And it's the main organ that processes these information based on also environmental factors and then produces actions and reactions, right? So everything we do in this world, in this reality that we call reality, is on the basis of the processing of brain, right? Brain cells and signals and its neuronal activity, which are at the level of chemicals as well as electrical activity. Yeah, and so, the rose example is a great one because what I also like to think of is, the light we seek on the outside is
Yeah.
actually even literally is within us, right? If you look at the electrical activity of the neurons, like what we are doing right now with this conversation, the activity of the neurons, which are electrical activity, so that light is always sparking, right? So the light we seek on the outside is in fact already within us. So yeah.
Oh, wow. So I always thought that light was in and of itself, but you're saying we're actually processing the light inside of ourselves.
Yeah, in the sense like the electrical activity, if you think of it as light, right? Because that's
Yeah.
what there's this electrical activity or bursts of activity in every single cell in our brain happening all the time. So in that sense, right, that analogy that the light we
Yeah.
see is actually within us. Yeah.
Wow. So then, the brain, we have information that we get from our brain, and the information, like we're saying, the antenna is picking it up, and we're realizing, different things that are happening in our external environment and as well as in our internal environment. Where in the brain is that processed?
hmm Yeah, that's a very important question. So, an area that is very increasing right now in the field of neuroscience is called interoception. And interoception literally means, in the simplest form, is the ability of the brain to listen to the body, right? So, the main information about internal senses, if we call it, or sometimes even sixth sense, or the internal dialogue that's happening between the brain and body, is being processed by the brain stem. So our brain stem is the main sort of gateway that receives information from the body, and that information is processed by there are many different nuclei in the brain stem which listen to heart rate, which listen to breathing, gut functions. But there is one particular brain area called the nucleus of the solitary tract, or an NTS in short. And NTS has this really cool map of all of the organs that actually send information to the brain. And so it has this map of heart, the gut, the lungs, and other organs. And then it processes that information and sends these information from the brainstem then onto our forebrain. So our forebrain has many different regions that then are important for cognitive processing, reactions, behavioral processing, all of those. And one of the centers in the forebrain called the insular cortex is actually what receives all of these visceral or internal sense information, processes that information, and then sends that information in turn to brain areas like the amygdala, which maybe some of you or you are familiar with, which is important for processing fight or flight or freeze responses when we are stressed, right? So there's a lot of this intricate interplay happening in regards to our internal senses or these visceral inputs. And then, of course, the environmental inputs, like, for example, what we see is such an intricate process as well, right? So the way we see, for example, a flower, right, the color, all of that is together processed by our eyes, our visual system, our nose, olfactory system, and that information also then through multiple synapses or projections goes into the cortical area. So the cortex itself is very important for receiving, processing this information, and allowing, those things what we call as critical thinking, decision making, all of these aspects, right? So there's a lot of interplay even within the brain itself between a lot of its subregions to process information.
And it always amazes me, even with music, how we can hear music inside of our brain, because essentially the ears are almost like the microphone, and it's
Mhm.
being processed inside the brain, and you could hear literally note for note the music you were listening to, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Like how intricately all these tiny little cells and the connections, the synapses all process these information that we don't put a lot of thought into to allow this whole reality to form that we call reality, right?
Yeah, and like I said, it's undervalued, and there's I like to think of the different worlds that we can encounter. So they say there's the different domains. I think the five domains are land, air, sea, space,
Mhm.
and then there's also cyberspace, right? Like when you get into your phones and things like that. And then
Mhm.
also think there's the sixth domain, which is the U inverse, as Robert Edward Grant says. And the sixth domain is what's inside of your mind. Like you could live a whole life just inside of yourself if you really wanted to, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
and then you can mirror, like if you look at the way the neurons are, the way they're connected, if you take a snapshot of that, it's sort of symmetrical or similar to the way space looks with all the stars and everything, sort of the gateways. Um, so there's, as much as there's a universe outside of yourself, there's you inverse inside of yourself, which is very vast and expansive as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's the really fascinating thing about, right, the world or the universe. Like even within one single cell is so vast, right? We're only beginning to understand some of this aspect of just a single cell, right? What it's comprised of. Like for example, a cell has mitochondria, all these other organelles as well, and they all have very specific function. It's as if like it's a machinery that's in place, which is very fascinating. So this is the microscopic world, but if you look at the macroscopic world or the cosmic world also, there's so many similarities like you bring up. There's that famous picture, right, of a single hippocampal brain cell and a picture of the universe, I think taken by one of the, I forget which satellite it was, but it's really amazing because when you put them side by side, the cell and this cosmic picture, they look exactly the same, right? So I think that the whole world inside of us can, like you said, be a universe in itself, and we can spend our whole lifetimes, right, trying to understand that inner world too, just like we humans have been spending so many, I guess, years and years trying to understand the outside world.
Correct. How would you, from the work you've done, how would you advise people to take care of their brain? And this may be, in terms of information, like we've always heard doing puzzles helps your brain, right? Especially in the older ages. Music for people with dementia helps the brain, but maybe even more sort of, basic and in a physical sense, general health for your brain. Because we've had pioneers like Dr. Daniel Amen, who, wrote his book, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life, when they did the MRI scans, people who sort of drink alcohol or who smoke, you can actually see holes in your brain, right? And then also the work with Dr. Andrew Huberman,
Mhm.
with his recent podcast also, people are sort of getting more information on, what is actually happening to the brain when we do all of these things that we've done in our culture, which is acceptable socially. What are your thoughts on that when you tell people or advise them on how to take care of the health of their brain?
Yeah, this is an area that I'm very much involved in right now, right? Understanding what are the things that allow our brain to have longevity and more neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the neurons in the brain to form connections, right? Even as we age and all of that. And, the general advice, or at least not just my advice, but from a lot of, research that's been going on, there are four key factors that are important, right? So, of course, nutrition. We don't tend to focus too much on nutrition sometimes, and nutrition meaning like things that are healthy for our heart. So like Mediterranean diet, plant-based diet, they have been shown consistently to be very beneficial for our bodily health, right? But those are the same types of nutrition that are also great for brain, right? So of course, nutrition is a key factor, but nutrition can also go beyond things we consume, right? Like things in social media, information, even conversations with people are some form of nutrition, right? And that can alter the activity of the brain. And then we also tend to not think of things like movement and exercise beyond exercise. So of course, exercise that helps cardiovascular health, our metabolic health, are great for the body as well as the brain. But exercise or beyond movement, there's also movement of our breath, right? So our breath is very, very important for oxygenating our cells in the body, but also most of that oxygen that we consume through breathing actually is causing the neuronal cells to work, right? They wouldn't work without the oxygenation. And so I think the importance of breathing cannot be overemphasized, like you brought up, so many researchers are showing, right? Like a just simple act of focusing on our breath, having these extended exhalations or micro practices of focusing and not holding our breath, is very important for brain and body function, right? These are simple things, I think very approachable, that we can do even while we're walking, even when we are, between two meetings or those transition times. And then there are things like connection, right? So connection consistently has been shown through research to be very important for our brain health, right? So a lot of times we think of connection as social connections, which are important. As humans, we are social beings or social animals, and we need connection. But there's also connection to things like nature, connection to things like our own inner self, which are all aspects of connection, or even, connection to things like rituals in our life and others, which gives some kind of discipline in our life, but also that place to go when we feel stressed, when we feel down, so that it's like this safe sort of place, right? So those kind of connections are great. And then another key important aspect for brain health is sleep or rest, or even, these small practices of taking pauses, like meditation, right? Because the more the brain works and it doesn't get rest, that means the cells are working consistently and not getting that time to recalibrate or allow, detoxification of the cells even. And so sleep is very important, because that's also, one of the reasons we have memory formations. It's important for consolidation of memories or things we learn throughout the day. And so I think combined together, I would say, things like healthy diet, nutrition, connection, rest, and exercise and movement, right? So these are the key things that sometimes we take for granted, but they're great for our body health as well as brain health.
And this is the two-way street between the brain and the body, because you cannot feed the brain directly, right? It has to be through the body and through the senses with all of these things, like you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is the body. That's why it's the body is what sets the tone of the brain, right? To do the things it does. And so I think, a lot of times in neuroscience research too, the body has been sort of considered separate from the brain, and studied separately, right? Like William James, almost a century ago, had said the brain and body are inseparable. But then, William Bard's theory sort of separated that, and brain was at the center of everything, controlling everything in the body. And we're now in this phase where we're understanding that, in fact, the brain and body are constantly communicating with one another, and they're not separate, right? So by altering our bodily functions, we can actually also alter our brain functions.
Got it. And should we be worried? I mean, in the sense that if we have that, sip of alcohol, or if we have sugar, which is, considered to be a neurotoxin, that we're killing a drastic amount of neurons. Like, are we born with limited neurons, or are neurons always developing? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the field of neurogenesis has also gone through so many phases. Neurogenesis meaning new neuron formation, right? This
Yeah.
field that has been studying this, especially in older population. And there have been like so many controversies that have come out that say, like, after 25 years, our neurons stop, forming. New neurons don't form in the brain. And then studies that also show that neurons do form, especially in certain brain areas, like the hippocampus and few other brain areas, I think the olfactory cortex as well. And so from the research so far, it shows that there is a possibility for new neurons to form until we age, in certain areas of the brain, right? Not the whole brain. And you're right, toxins like alcohol, and that's also gone through a lot of controversy, some saying little bit of alcohol is good, wine is good, resveratrol is good, and then others saying not even a little bit of alcohol is good for the brain. And I think we're in the consensus right now in the field that alcohol in general is not good for the brain because it does kill brain cells, especially in the area of the brain called the cerebellum, which is important for balance and coordination. And so, it is, I think a lot of it is about balance too, or that equilibrium state, or homeostasis is what it's described as. That I think everything has to be balanced, and the way our body function is also in that balanced state, right? Yin and a yang. So if we're stressed and our sympathetic nervous system is activated, there's also a system in place in our body and brain that dampens that sympathetic activation and brings balance, right? And so, of course, when we're stressed for long periods of time or repeatedly stressed, then one system like the sympathetic may be overly activated. And so I think it's all about bringing our systems into balanced state as much as we can. Sometimes it may not be possible to completely avoid, alcohol or other things that we put in our body, but how do we balance or recuperate or allow, some form of detoxification? I think those are also key factors, not like completely, I guess, abandoning if it's possible, but,
Yeah.
I think it's all about figuring out what's the best way we can handle a balanced state within our body and brain, right? So that's what I'll say. I don't want to prescribe and say like, don't drink alcohol at all, or don't put sugar in our body, because it also depends a lot on our body type, our social environment, a lot of other factors too, right? Genetics plays a huge role also in being vulnerable versus resilient to certain factors and things like that. So I think it's
Yeah.
also about figuring out our own self in that sense.
Sure. And also I think we live in a world of opposites where again it's not cut and dry, it's not black and white, that something has to die in order for us to live, right? So in order for us to live, we have to eat. In order to eat, we have to kill something, right? So something has to die for us to live. If we do something, there's going to be an opposite reaction to that, right? So if we're taking things like alcohol, sugar, it might have some certain benefits, but then on the flip side, it's going to have some things that are not so good for us. And I think, there's two sides, for every coin. And I personally think there's a third side of a coin, but that's for a different conversation. So yeah, again, it's not black and white. And if you do something, it's going to have another effect. Just be cautious of that effect. With NeuroChetanā, so that is something else that your work brings you to, where you're sort of trying to bring together science and spirituality. And traditionally, people think of science and spirituality as two separate entities. But I think you're trying to sort of say, no, really, they're the same thing. I was wondering if you could just talk about NeuroChetanā, maybe, start by explaining the name. And
Mhm.
essentially, I think, we have science, but then when we think of spirituality, we're not talking about God and religion. We're talking about maybe the foundations of the world. So science is essentially explaining the foundations. So maybe you could talk a bit about NeuroChetanā.
Yeah, yeah, this is something I have been working on for the last 10 years now. And, sort of bringing this aspect of science and spirituality, and through my own learnings and journey and own trials and tribulations of, going through a lot of things in life, come to the realization that science and spirituality, like you just shared, are not separate from one another. So NeuroChetanā itself means, of course, neuro comes from neuroscience, and Chetana actually means consciousness, right? And so Chetana, NeuroChetanā is a way of bringing that consciousness through the brain in a way, because brain, like you said, is the vehicle or that transmitter of that consciousness. And if we look at consciousness, consciousness is a fundamental aspect of our being, right? So in neuroscience, consciousness is thought of as something that emerges from the properties of the brain, the neurons firing, that allows, this feeling of having consciousness. But then there is a whole group of neuroscientists who are theoretical neuroscientists, like Anil Seth and others, who've also been proposing that actually consciousness itself is fundamental. And in that consciousness, or from that consciousness, space, time, and matter arises. So including our thoughts, including our bodies, are all in the field of consciousness. So consciousness is fundamental. And that's what I want to bring, or I've been working on bringing with NeuroChetanā, is that aspect, right? That fundamentally we are whole, we are complete, right? So that wholeness within us, when I say wholeness, I mean consciousness, right? So from that consciousness, everything else emerges and allows us to process the world. And so it's an interesting journey, because, there's if you look at science, like you were saying earlier, science allows us to make sense of this world, outside world that we perceive as the world, through our brain cells, and we give meaning to it, right? So the brain gives meaning to the things we experience. But if we go deeper, we start to see that aspect of experience requires first to have consciousness, or what we can call subjectivity, right? So even the questions we ask in science, like for example, any theory, any hypothesis that we generate in science, first starts with the conscious perception or processing, right? That's subjectivity. And then we go on to use the tools, the tangible tools that science has, to now tease apart how cells are working, how molecules are working, how the cosmos itself functions. And so if we go deeper, we see that science is actually subjectivity, right? It begins with that consciousness. And so in that sense, I mean, science and spirituality are not separate. And exactly, it's not about religion. It's not about, putting a god or someone in a higher pedestal and saying this person is like controlling the world. But I think the aspect of science and spirituality in real sense, when it comes together, when we have that understanding, it actually allows us to see that nothing is separate from one another, right? What we call science is actually spirituality. What we call spirituality is actually science too, right? A lot of the things that we do in spirituality may not be the same tools we use in science, right? That's tangible, but yet it is a process of being a scientist of our own self. It's a process of understanding our thoughts, putting our thoughts under the microscope, for example, microscope of the mind. And so in that sense, or the questions we ask in science and spirituality, like, who am I? Truly, who am I, right? Like, if I'm not this name, Abha, or if I'm not this body, then who I truly am I? And when you start shedding all these aspects of yourself, there's a very simple aspect of you that remains, and that's just the experiencer or the knower or the perceiver of these things, right? So all the things that we experience the world through, like the body, the mind, the brain, are just tools. And so, but in science also, it's the same questions we ask, right? Who am I? But we are focusing more on the outside, in a way, things that are tangible, right? I am these cells, I am these molecules, I am these organs, these systems in my body. And then same with other questions, right? Like, what is my purpose in life? Or why am I here? Or in this grand scheme of things, this cosmic sort of perspective, what am I, right? Like, who am I? And so I think when we truly bring science and spirituality together and see things with these two lenses, it's about that yin and yang, in the sense it allows us to see that subjectivity and objectivity are not separate, right? The objectivity gets meaning from the subjectivity, and they always go hand in hand through this experience of what we call life itself. And a lot of this is also based on Advaita Vedanta, or non-dual philosophy, which I've read a lot of books on, Ramana Maharshi's and others, which makes sense, right? A lot of aspect of perception, the way we make sense of world, all begins with what we called a spiritual process, and then that leads to science itself. So hopefully that makes sense.
Oh, definitely. And it's funny. I'm just coming off reading Dandapani's book, where he talks about the importance of being able to focus and concentrate. And he actually separates the mind and consciousness, right? So he considers consciousness a glowing ball of awareness, and it can actually go through different parts of the mind, which is, maybe happiness, sadness, anger. And that was very sort of eye-opening for me, because traditionally we think, we are the mind. So
Mm-hmm.
when we're experiencing happiness, we're sort of fixed at that point. But really he's saying that, consciousness is this awareness that's, shining on the happiness part of the brain. You can actually move it to the sad part of the brain, or to the, the anger part of the mind rather. And again, this was, passed down from his guru, because for neuroscience, we're using all these advanced technologies to help us understand things on the quantum level, which is essentially the spiritual level. But the holy books that you speak of, they actually figured this out way, way back through maybe meditation and thinking, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? Like how a lot of this knowledge came to, these yogis or rishis through meditative practices and being in those states, right? They, like, even if you dig into mathematics and a lot of aspects of science, there was so much knowledge that was gained through this. And so it's really fascinating, right? Like we tend to focus, like you said, on the tools and techniques and teasing apart, reducing, which is a huge part of science, right? Reductionism, but not putting things back together, right? We may understand one part of our body, one part of our brain, or this molecule does this cell does this. But then I think what misses out in science sometimes is that wholeness, right? Putting everything back together, because actually everything emerges from that wholeness. And a lot of these aspects that you share, Dandapani's book, and others, it's exactly that, right? That mind itself, or even brain itself, or body itself, is something in the field of consciousness or awareness. And mind, just like the sky, if we look at that as consciousness, then in that field, mind actually exists like clouds. And so, in fact, in reality, the mind doesn't exist, right? We give it form and shape, but in reality, the mind is only a field where thoughts emerge and thoughts disappear. So, if we go deeper into that, we start to see it's not really a mind, right? There's only things or field where things appear and disappear. So that's also fascinating. And that mind is part of this bigger consciousness also.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for coming on the episode and sharing thoughts of the work that you do. If people want to get a hold of your work, where's the best place for them to reach you?
I think right now is the website. My website, neurochetana.com, is
Yeah.
a great way. And, if I am starting to also do a sharing circle sort of soon in October, where we can look at things from this science and sage perspective. So I want to do something where it's like a science and spirituality discussion weekly. And so that's something to look out for if you sign up on my website, bringing together this. So that's the best way. And then within that, if you reach out, then yeah, I can share my email and others. And then I have a social media account in Instagram right now called NeuroBreathe. And that's also another way, if you want to stay connected.
Okay, great. And I'll put those in the show notes as well. Thanks again for coming on the show, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much, Croydon, for the invite. Take care.